Mitch. You're killing me, Mitch. You're killing me. Thank you. Well, good afternoon to all of you. And again, I'm DavidForman, and it's just wonderful to be back at an HCI event. It's always a special pleasure to be introduced by Bill, and I'd like to thank Shane and Kara for doing a great job again, and also providing about 100 of you copies of Fearless HR, Driving Business Results. I want to spend just a couple of minutes talking about sort of how this book came to be over a 2-year period of time, because I think the key themes really relate very, very strongly to the L&D community. So again, great to be here. As you think about sort of the context that we're all in, about 75 to 80% of HR organizations are going through some change to be closer to the business. This is a framework that Dave Ulrich and others have used to talk a little bit about the evolution of our profession from polite to police to partner to player. It is not that being polite and police aren't important. They are. They're very important, but they're no longer sufficient if HR is to really play a very, very different role in the organization. We need to move to the right-hand side of the picture to become looked at as more of a partner to the business and a player, somebody who can make something happen on a regular basis. Bob Bennett from Federal Express actually gave an address at one of HCI's conferences where he talked a little bit more specifically about what this meant, to be able to go from what he called a bricklayer, a foundational level organization, to one that can architect and to build. And you can see the words there as he talks about proactive, business-focused, global, results-oriented solution provider. And so, you know, why are these changes being made that we're probably all in the midst of? Well, according to some, HR has issues. Many of you probably read what Keith Hammonds wrote in 2005 in Fast Company called Why We Hate HR. And he talked about us being obstacles and being too process-driven and too much into our own language and in our own silo. But you know, that was 10 years ago, right? So that's all gone. That doesn't really exist anymore. Not so much. This was last year, the cover of the Harvard Business Review. It's time to blow up HR. So our friend Peter Capelli, who you'll hear tomorrow afternoon, actually wrote an article here talking about how we need to repurpose HR. But in other words, these feelings, these perceptions are with people. And so that was kind of one side of the equation as I thought about taking some time from my duties at HCI and taking a couple years off to write a book. I wanted to write something that made a contribution, was somewhat distinctive. So you heard all these things, but then the other side of the, some reasons again for this is that, you know, we're a relatively new profession. The first HR organization was founded in 1901 at the NCR Corporation in Dayton, Ohio. We do have an administrative legacy. If you look at SHRM's previous names, it has to do with the American Personnel Administration Society. So we have a strong sort of administrative legacy, and that's not necessarily tied to, you know, a real positive attitude for many. We are an overhead function. We are part of indirect labor. If you look at balance sheets, we're typically in the SG&A line. So people look at, you know, people in overhead functions to say, hey, you're probably not making as much a contribution as people who are direct labor and actually making something. And we've had a cavalcade of names over the past. We've started out as industrial relations, personnel, you know, human relations, human resources, and now you see names like people operations and a variety of other names to try to describe sort of our new vision. So the cavalcade of names means that our purpose, at least as I saw it, our purpose hasn't been very clear or distilled. And so these are some reasons why these historical perceptions, I think, have existed. But then there's the other side of the story that's much more research-based. When you take a look at what we can become, over 20 years of research has said that when organizations have effective people practices, it drives the business. It improves productivity. It allows you to save cost. It has a variety of very, very healthy impacts. Dave Ulrich in the RBL group, Results-Based Leadership, said up to 20% of an organization's performance can be tied back to an effective HR function. And we all know about intangibles and the difference between the market value and the book value of a company. And intangibles are driven by people and their ability to innovate, to improve the brand, to improve quality of service and be more responsive. And so as boards of directors look at this and say, hey, most of the value of my company is now based on intangibles, they turn to HR and say, how are we doing on those? We getting any better? What's that trend line look like? And oh, by the way, most of the cost of an organization are tied up in people cost. So the very same board of directors are going to say, how are we doing? Are we leveraging our people? Are our people considered to be assets or just costs? What does that look like? So you had two very kind of interesting sides of the story. You had these historical perceptions, and then you had what the data are showing us. And so this is really kind of, at least for me, and it took me 6 months to come up with sort of the value proposition or point of view that's demarcated in the book. And here are the 4 points, and I think these all apply to the L&D community. HR or L&D must confront its past before realizing its future. If you don't address these attitudes that people have or perceptions that people have, they're just going to be further ingrained in corporate memory, and they're going to be much harder to deal with. And I didn't feel, looking at our literature, the people that I interact to, that we really honestly faced up to these in a systematic way. HR professionals must think and act like business leaders, not simply as HR or L&D professionals. So this is very important in terms of the credibility that we have in the organization, to be able to be seen as a business leader, not just a functional leader. HR's purpose is to drive business results, period. There is no equivocation here. The business's agenda is HR's agenda. And when we come to that point, I believe it's a clarifying moment where other things like line of sight and roles and responsibilities become much clearer. A cohesive purpose can lead to a cycle of value. So as I think about these 4 things, they get operationalized in the book that I wrote in front of you. This is sort of the architecture, what I call the double helix version of Fearless HR. So part 1 is about the historical perceptions. We don't add any value. We're too siloed and inwardly focused. We're a weak discipline with poor tools. Measures are too soft and subjective. And we're in a stodgy, dead-end career. Other than that, Mrs. Lincoln, how was the play, right? So what I attempted to do in part 1 of the book is to hold up these views to research and best practices, and to say, are these true or not? And of course, what you find out is that they are not true. They're a bias, they're a stereotype. But that does not mean we are anywhere near good enough yet to drive the business forward and to achieve the purpose that I think is so, and the clarifying purpose that I think is so important. So part 2, in the middle sphere here, is about how we get better. We have to build our capability, and I'll come back to that word capability. We have to strengthen our professional networks, communities, and associations. So thank you all for being here. I hope you're meeting a lot of really valuable people where you can extend your professional network. My feeling is this is a hugely undervalued asset that we tend to neglect. Reid Hoffman has this statement in his book, The Alliance, I to the power of we. That is, the value that we bring to ourselves and our organizations is directly commensurate with the strength and depth of our professional networks. We should be doing a much better job about building our professional networks. Implement the right HR levers, the right L&D levers to drive the business results. And then finally, be fearless. Have a point of view. Don't sit mutely at a table but be able to stand up for your point of view, move the business forward, engage in constructive discussions. And finally, on the right-hand side are the business results, right? We can talk about what do we mean by making the business more effective. Creating a context for talent and innovation to flourish. We heard that word flourish earlier today. And what's interesting, people can talk about us as being part of overhead, but if we do our job right and create context and culture, we're actually improving the performance of tens and hundreds of people and provide a lot more value than just our own salary in return to the organization. Improve the business through better alignment, cost savings, and productivity improvements. We're often thought of as people who take things away, and sure, our organizations have to be more efficient and we have to cut costs, and we frequently have to make those changes happen. But better alignment, are we working on things that are really critical to the business, or are they projects that aren't so critical? Are they a waste of time? And productivity improvement is actually the biggest lever that we have to move the business forward. So let's think about how we can improve the business in those three ways. And finally, in many ways, the ultimate result of being a valued professional in HR or L&T is, are you being a trusted and effective business leader? Again, another key theme here is functional excellence is no longer enough if we really want to contribute to the organization. So the notion of a business leader. And again, when you translate these to the L&D community, I think it works perfectly. And by the way, this is where I started my career right here in Boston over 30 years ago in the L&D community, in the training business. So this is kind of special for me to be back here talking about the impact of my work over the last couple years, especially in the L&D space. And I've actually seen some people that I worked with way back then, so a special treat. So here are some perceptions, this notion of L&D focusing on the historical perceptions that we have to address. You may not agree with all of these. Some of these are seemingly simple to us, that training and development are synonymous. We know they are not, but a lot of people still feel that way. And we can chastise them for, come on, get with it, or we can just recognize that, hey, let's understand how they think about this and use it as a time to educate them, to talk about the differences. If anybody looked at the Sunday New York Times, this is a really nice piece that talks about development and the winding path to success for future CEOs. Doesn't talk about training. It talks about experiences. It talks about a variety of different approaches. It doesn't talk about a linear path. It talks about a winding path to the top. So very, very much a development point. So again, these are things that people have in mind. We should be able to cite data and cite best practices that address these. And if you don't, we actually generated this list in a webinar that I held on this topic, and these came from people. And if you don't think that this is kind of current, or if you don't think this is important to do, let me hold up another publication here. This is the latest Harvard Business Review. Again, Peter's article is in here about performance management. He'll talk about that. But why leadership training fails and what to do about it is on page 51. And the first couple lines are, corporations are victims of the great training robbery. American companies spend enormous amounts of money on employee training and education, $160 billion in the United States, but they're not getting a good return on their investment. So we have some work to do. This good article talks about the importance of building an infrastructure around training, not just training itself, but we have some work to do. And I think confronting our past is an important way to think about it. So how can we get better at business-centric learning, which is the key theme of this conference? How can we become better business people to be able to add value in different ways to the organization and to address some of these interests or concerns? Dave Ulrich, who was kind enough to write the foreword to my book, has this little litmus test. When he talks to different organizations, he basically says, how's business? kind of simple question. And what he says is, if the response to that, you start talking about, well, we have this compensation program or this recognition program or our high potential program, he said, it's going to be a long day. What he really wants you to do, right, is to talk about the business of the business. So how's your business doing? How are your key competitors? How are you being buffeted by market forces? He says, if you understand that, then you're starting to make another level of impact into your organization. So he uses this as a little Rorschach test to get a sense for where our minds are. This is a study from the Corporate Executive Board, just saying, hey, this whole thing about business acumen, if we don't demonstrate to our colleagues that we understand the business in our language and in our behavior, we're not even getting a chance to do some of these other things that we can do so well in terms of our specific functional areas of expertise. So this becomes important. Take a look, the impact of HR competencies on our role effectiveness. We have to, it's table stakes. We have to demonstrate that we understand the business. Here's a business acumen kind of IQ test I put together. Is L&D's agenda the business's agenda? That's kind of an alignment question. What are revenue and cost trends over the past 3 to 5 years in your organization? Going up, going down? What's the trend line look like? What are the patterns? Are some products or some regions contributing more in terms of revenues and cost? What percentage of your market value is attributed to intangibles? These are things you can calculate. If you just go to a balance sheet, subtract out the tangible assets, what's left are the intangible assets. And those are very important, especially to people in your board of directors. What's your revenue per employee, and how does this compare with your 3 top competitors? Very gross measure of productivity. Those of you into kind of psychometrics will say the same thing, but it's an interesting comparison, and it's one that we should know. And one we should ask ourselves, how can we make that picture better? How can we improve, revenue per employee? What can I do as an L&D professional to make that happen? And there's plenty. What's your new product vitality index? This is a very interesting measure that companies are looking at. Basically, it deals with what Jim was talking about today, in terms of a lot of companies being very complacent because they've been successful in the past. But how successful are we in the future? How quickly are innovations turning into products that are accepted by the marketplace? So the new product vitality index says, again, percent of revenue, you can see it the past 2 to 3 years. And do you have a financial buddy? For a lot of us, these financial concepts maybe aren't second nature. Some of you perhaps have come from a financial background. But a big deal here, again, it goes back to growing your network, is have people in the financial organization, the IT organization, the marketing organization that you connect with on a regular basis so you can learn more about the business. They're going to learn a ton from you, but let's get out of our silos and let's have these, what the anthropologists call bridging networks out of where we are to other parts of the organization. Do a SWOT analysis on your company. This is something we actually do in our HR business partner class. It's real interesting, real simple, straightforward tool. We've probably already done it, but it's a really good thing to do, because if this is what's important to your company from a strategic basis, it should be important to you. Again, as you think about these various quadrants, some you can control, the internal factors you can, the external factors you can't, but you have to be able to respond to, to make sure that you can, serve your organization and be as agile as you can be. So think about the 4 M's with the SWOT analysis. How can you maximize strengths? How can you minimize weaknesses? How can you magnify opportunities? How can you mitigate risk and threats? And what can you do as an L&D professional to make this picture better? Outcome measures, right? One of the things we said in Fearless HR is, hey, our measures are too soft and subjective. And by and large, it's been true. We measure what's easy to measure, what we can count, or we tend to focus more on efficiency rather than effectiveness and outcomes. We need to start thinking about effectiveness and outcomes and being able to tie our practices to what that looks like. So this is just a list. This is actually from one of the tools in the book. Here are various outcomes. So each of our businesses are going to be different. I know you're sitting at industry table groups, but there are probably 3 to 5 outcomes that are very, very important for your business. So what are they? Identify them. Are you measuring those? Are you doing things that can positively affect those outcomes? Intangibles. We talked about intangible measures and golly, how important they are to the market value of the company. So again, what intangibles are important, especially to your board members and to your executive committees? What does that look like? And again, you see things like brand and market share and product quality and innovation obviously being very, very critical for most organizations today. The quality of your customers, the quality of your supply chain, the quality of your service partners. So just like outcomes, these intangible measures become really important, and they are the things that business leaders think about. And so if they think about them, we should think about them. So how do we get better, right? Okay, here's ways to kind of be attuned and do scans of what's going on out there so we can, in our words and actions and alignment, can do a better job. But also as getting better as a professional. I think we've heard from really prestigious people today, and I'm sure you'll continue to hear it. As a professional, you're never done, right? It's always about getting better. Things change constantly. So this is a commitment. This isn't an event. And so the notion of an HR capability framework or something that's tied to your own company's initiatives or values, I've created a capability framework here in the book that says you have to go beyond competency models. You know, these are things that, like, for us, is kind of like pablum, right? We've all been raised on competency models. You show a competency model to a business leader, they'll fall asleep. They'll yawn. We have to think about capabilities and what we can do to move the organization going forward. So I call this a hybrid model because there are competencies in it, kind of the how to get to the what. And so this is kind of tough to read here, but you see the how up top and the what down below. And this is familiar. I've kind of gone over this in terms of what Fearless HR talks about, but you can see create the context, improve the business, become a trusted business partner. The roles that business leaders would like to see us play are to be more strategic in our vision, to be this notion of a force multiplier, so what we do affects multiple people, build networks in the organization. I think engagement has been such a key factor for us over the past 2 to 3 decades, but engagement focuses on individual people. I think the next 10 to 20 years, it's going to be about collaboration and teams and how individuals work together. And I love what Jim said today about the meaningful relationships among people, not just the incidental relationships. But it's going to be much more about building networks and collaboration, and finally, operational executor. And again, these are just my take at, I think, some of the things that we need from a building block or more of a competency point of view. But think capabilities, right? Think driving the business, not just competencies. So the steps to take, whether you use this model or you have one yourself, is each of us should have our development plans. And we shouldn't just evaluate ourselves. We all know the problems with self-evaluation, probably being the least reliable of any ways to evaluate your skills. I'm a big believer in colleague evaluation. Yeah, your boss, important step, but get the information from your colleagues. If you look at work rules from Laszlo Bock and Google, they do an awful lot of that. And I don't think it's by accident. I think it's intentional. I think colleagues maybe provide the most reliable and valid source of information about ourselves. So think about where you want to go, gather data, get a sense for if you're there, how other people view you, and then have a development portfolio such as this. It says, hey, in the next 6 months, this is what I'm doing. These are my developmental goals, and here's how I'm going to measure it. Here's how I'm going to know if I'm there or not. It's just not a self-report thing or a check-the-box thing, right? We need to be more data-driven as a profession. Again, historical perceptions. People say, HR folks, you're real good with words, not quite so good with numbers. So even in our own development planning, let's be empirical about this. Let's gather some data. And the sequence of these 4 things is important in terms of how we get better, whether the audience is HR professionals or L&D professionals. One is we have to have a target. So how do we get better? That's the capability model. What am I reaching for? Building professional networks, right? If you want to know something these days, a fact, you're going to Google it. If you want wisdom or advice or thoughtfulness, you're going to go to somebody in your professional network, somebody whose opinion and value you trust. This is a hugely important asset for all of us. What are the right levers in demonstrating a fearless mindset? The order here is important, because if you demonstrate a fearless mindset without getting any better, not going to work so well, right? So you have to know the goods, and then it's the point of view, it's the conviction, it's the strength of your presentation. And so be fearless, last and least here in terms of last and most, I should say. Take risks, be bold, have a point of view. It's why I think this is such a great time to be doing what we're doing. I couldn't agree more with a couple of the speakers this morning who said this really is a great time to be doing what we're doing. It's our time. It's just we're not so good about articulating the benefits of what we do. Sometimes we're not so good about really focusing on the business and aligning what we're doing to that clarity of purpose, which is to make the business more effective. And to be able to do that, we need to be fearless. It's, from my point of view, this whole notion of HR, a seat at the table, is way too low of an aspiration. We want a people that lead and drive the business. And when that happens, doesn't this look like the picture that Jim bought at Santa Fe with Ronnie? Yeah, okay, so there you go. More about the book, if any of you are interested, on the website here. There's tools and stuff you can download, so take a look. And just a couple last words from me. I continue to learn a lot from my students and the people that I've worked with over the years. Tomorrow I have to fly off to Boeing to do a program for them. And this comes from the previous head of HR at Boeing. I think it's a great quote. HR is the only function that touches every single person. Excellence, and this is from an engineer himself. Tony was an engineer coming into the HR profession. Excellence in engineering leads to strong products. Excellence in finance leads to strong financial capabilities. Excellence in HR leads to a great company. Remember, one of the other perceptions was that, gee, we don't have a very interesting career. Well, there's all sorts of things to say, not so much. And this is from Laszlo again at Google. The McKinsey consultant, the brightest of the bright, could have gone anywhere. When he decided to go into HR, his friend said, "You're doing what?" He said, So far from a professional suicide, my time at Google HR has been a whitewater ride of experimentation and creation, sometimes exhausting, sometimes frustrating, but always surging forward to create an environment of purpose, freedom, and creativity. That'll make you get up in the morning, huh? Good. Thanks for your time. Be fearless. Thank you.